Clicking sounds, sounds that reveal the presence of radioactive rays. The instrument, a Geiger counter, is converting radioactivity into sounds we can hear.
Invented in 1928 by Hans Geiger and Walter Müller, the modern Geiger counter, along with its cousin, the scintillation detector, became an icon of the atomic age in the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s. Nuclear testing and the threat of atomic attack spurred public interest in detecting radioactivity, in uranium prospecting to build new weapons, and in civil defense to protect the population in the event of a nuclear war. This interest in radioactivity was amplified by a relatively new genre of motion pictures: science fiction. From monsters
like a machine gun
to Martians. Many, if not most, of the science fiction films produced in the 1950s made some connection to atomic bombs or radioactivity.
I believe it feeds on the radiation from your atomic plants, and that it's evil.
Golly, it's true, we're not radioactive anymore.
And the Geiger counter was part of the cast.
What you got in here, fella? Ticking like a bomb.
Since that time, prominent nuclear power plant accidents like 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in 1986, and Fukushima in 2011 have again piqued public interest in radioactivity. The proliferation of inexpensive electronics has produced a deluge of Geiger counters in every price range, the likes of which have not been seen for decades. Geiger counters are now available for under $100 and even under $50. Buyer beware. There are Geiger-based dosimeters, which supposedly measure your absorbed dose of radiation. And there are Geiger counter attachments for smartphones and Geiger counter watches. While we applaud this new interest in measuring radioactivity, the fact of the matter is that many people who own a Geiger counter are unaware of its limitations. The fact of the matter is, your Geiger counter may be lying to you. What is your Geiger counter detecting and measuring? What is it not detecting? Counts per minute and microsieverts, what do those numbers on the screen tell us about radioactive sources? I'm not here to bash Geiger counters. I love my Geiger counter and I use it frequently. So before we discuss the lies and limitations of Geiger counters, I want to take a look at what Geiger counters do well. But be sure to stay tuned until the end because we're saving the best until last. One of the strengths of the Geiger counter is its ability to detect relatively low levels of radioactivity. The Geiger counter's high sensitivity to beta and, for some models, alpha radiation makes it an ideal tool for checking surface contamination and food contamination. In this demonstration, we are measuring radioactivity from a salt substitute. This salt substitute, potassium chloride, is a natural beta emitter. Potassium contains 1/100th of 1% of a natural radioactive isotope called potassium-40. The strong beta output of potassium-40 registers immediately on the Geiger counter. Now let's perform the same measurement using the scintillation detector, which is designed primarily to detect gamma rays. The potassium-40 isotope is a gamma emitter. However, these gamma rays occur infrequently. Only 11% of potassium-40 disintegrations give off gamma rays. As a result, the total absorbed energy is very slight. Consequently, the scintillation detector registers close to background levels. In this case, the Geiger counter's definitive response to potassium-40 is a distinct advantage. Geiger counters are great tools for prospecting for radioactive minerals and pinpointing sources of radioactivity. The Geiger counter can be used to locate hotspots on granite countertops, in ceramic tiles, and in ceramic fixtures such as sinks and toilets. Though Geiger counters are unable to differentiate between different types of radiation, alpha, beta, and gamma, the nature of the radioactivity can be determined by experimentation. This disk contains a small dot of americium-241, a strong alpha emitter. Since alpha particles only travel a couple of centimeters in the air, their presence is easily determined by proximity. And alpha particles are easy to block. Even a thin sheet of paper will prevent most particles from entering the detector. A business card or index card will stop all alpha particles. Beta particles are more penetrating and more difficult to block. This disk contains strontium-90, a powerful beta emitter. Since beta particles go right through paper, we use a thin piece of aluminum to determine their presence. For sources where beta is prevalent, placing the aluminum between the source and the detector results in a reduction of 40% or more in the count. Several sheets of aluminum are needed to block the beta particles completely, bringing the counter down to background levels. Lead, being 4 times more dense than aluminum, has more stopping power. The lead can also be used to deflect beta particles. By placing the beta source next to the detector and isolating it with a lead partition, we can use the lead sheet to bounce beta particles into the detector window. Unlike beta particles, gamma rays are not easily blocked by a thin sheet of lead. This jar of fragmented thoriated welding rods contains the isotope thorium-232. With a half-life of 14 billion years, thorium has a low rate of activity on the Geiger counter. However, the thorium decay chain has a powerful gamma emitter, thallium-208. Even a 1/4 inch of aluminum is not sufficient to block the gamma rays from this isotope. Nor is 1/4 inch of lead. To stop these gamma rays, we need more than 1 inch of lead shielding. And there you have it, alpha, beta, and gamma, differentiated with the Geiger counter. The Geiger counter is indeed a versatile and useful instrument, but it has a number of limitations that many users are unaware of, especially those who are new to measuring radioactivity. But before we consider the lies your Geiger counter is telling you, you need to understand the energy spectrum of radioactive decay. This diagram displays the energy levels of gamma radiation, which is characteristic of most radioactive decay. Across the bottom of the graph, energy is shown in thousands of electron volts, also called kilo-electron volts or simply keV. The frequency with which these energies are observed is shown along the side. Every radioactive isotope has its own energy signature, but since radioactive sources in nature contain more than one isotope, diagrams like these showing energy peaks from several isotopes are not unusual. On this scale of decay energy, values below 100 to 200 keV are considered low. At 59 keV, americium-241, found in smoke detectors, is a relatively weak gamma source. On the other side, energies above, say, 5 to 600 keV are relatively high. This spectrograph includes thallium, which is part of the thorium decay chain. At 2,615 keV, thallium packs a punch. So what does this have to do with lying Geiger counters? Your Geiger counter may be lying to you when it indicates that a source is not radioactive. But don't be too hard on it. This is usually a sin of omission. Despite its sensitivity to beta particles, the efficiency for detecting lower energy beta particles less than 100 keV is under 20%, even for the most sensitive instruments. Particles with less than 50 keV of energy are not likely to penetrate the detector window, which is made of mica. That's why very low energy particles, such as those given off by the decay of tritium at 18.6 keV, are virtually impossible to detect with a Geiger counter. High energy beta particles, on the other hand, can be detected at a much higher rate, exceeding 40% efficiency. Some calibration tests report efficiencies of 90% or more. The efficiency for detecting alpha particles is around 30% for pancake tube detectors. These efficiencies are even lower for smaller or poorly made instruments. All in all, the Geiger counter is a pretty inefficient instrument when we compare the actual number of disintegrations in the radioactive source to the number of counts on the detector. The CPM shown on your screen or meter is misleading if you fail to take this fact into account. Dangerous, highly active gamma sources afford even more opportunity for Geiger counter trickery, but this time the stakes are much higher. With few exceptions, most Geiger counters are designed for detecting relatively low levels of radiation, less than 1 Roentgen per hour, or about 10 millisieverts per hour. When exposed to deadly levels of radiation, say 100 Roentgen or about 1 sievert per hour, the counter exceeds its limit and becomes saturated. Some units may provide an overload warning, but many simply return to zero, as if no radiation were present. This detection deception, needless to say, can prove life-threatening. Fortunately, radioactive sources powerful enough to saturate a Geiger counter are highly regulated under the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Nevertheless, if there's a nuclear accident or attack and you think your Geiger counter has reached saturation, try distancing yourself from the source or shield the counter with a high-density material such as lead. But the best way to measure extremely high levels of radioactivity is to use a high-range instrument such as this vintage civil defense ionization chamber, which has a range some 500 to 1,000 times that of most Geiger counters. But be sure it is calibrated and in good repair. KI4U is, to my knowledge, the only private company in the U.S. that services and calibrates these older units, employing high-level sources of radiation under license. What about gamma rays? Is your Geiger counter telling the truth? Here again, unfortunately, the detector is being less than forthcoming. Even though gamma and X-ray sensitivity is often advertised as being less than 10 or 20 keV, not every gamma ray or X-ray which enters the Geiger counter will interact with the gas in the tube because the molecules are relatively far apart. The efficiency for detecting gamma radiation is less than 40% at best. We can demonstrate this by comparing the response of our Geiger counter to a basic scintillation detector which sells for less than $200 from Better Geiger. The solid crystal in the scintillation detector, even though it is minuscule compared to the Geiger tube, is more likely to intercept gamma rays. The source, americium-241, is a relatively weak gamma emitter. 85% of its gamma emissions weigh in at only 59 keV. The plastic petri dish over the Geiger counter's mica window blocks alpha particles and absorbs or slows some of the beta particles given off by isotopes in the americium-241 decay chain. The scintillation crystal, on the other hand, is already protected by the unit's plastic case. The Geiger counter reaches a maximum count of 1200 CPM. How does that compare to the scintillation detector? The gamma ray count on the scintillation detector is nearly 3.5 times that of the Geiger counter, a convincing demonstration of the Geiger counter's deficiency in detecting gamma radiation. The difference is even more dramatic than you think. The Geiger tube is highly responsive to gamma rays at 59 keV, more so than at any other energy level. At these low energies, the sensitivity is 4.5 times higher than it would be for energies above 200 keV, giving the false impression that there is more radiation. So even at peak sensitivity, the Geiger counter falls considerably short when it comes to detecting gamma rays. Yet another Geigerly misrepresentation. But in the absence of a scintillation detector, the Geiger tube's lopsided low-energy sensitivity can be advantageous in some instances. For example, checking X-ray machines for leakage, since these machines often operate in this lower energy range. Nevertheless, some manufacturers offer energy-compensated Geiger tubes which attempt to flatten the response curve of the detector, as shown here. This is usually accomplished by covering the detector window with tin or some other material that absorbs low-energy X-rays and gamma rays. We have finally come to the most common lie committed by your Geiger counter. Its measurement of absorbed energy, absorbed dose. Here the device has no conscience, as it manufactures one fabrication after another. What's worse, these falsehoods are eagerly repeated by many Geiger counter enthusiasts as they test their radioactive sources. But before I demonstrate this, you need to understand the difference between activity and absorbed energy, and exactly how a Geiger counter calculates energy. Activity is shown on the left side of the graphic. There are two components related to activity. The first component, displayed in the second column, refers to the number of nuclear disintegrations that occur in the isotope per unit time. These are expressed as disintegrations per second, also known as becquerels, or disintegrations per minute. The second component, which is shown in the first column, is the number of times radiation interacts with the detector, measured in counts per unit time, counts per second, and counts per minute. As we have shown, the Geiger counter is a relatively inefficient detector, so the number of counts per second on the Geiger counter should never be equated with the disintegrations per second, or becquerels, at the source. Shame on any manufacturer that allows users to choose becquerels as a display unit. Energy exposure is shown near the center of the graphic. This is a measure of the intensity of gamma rays and X-rays in air. The rate of exposure is measured in Roentgens per hour or coulombs per kilogram per hour. We will consider this in more detail later when we look at Geiger counter calibration. Now let's move toward the right side of the graphic under the columns labeled absorbed dose, equivalent dose, and effective dose. These refer to the amount of energy absorbed by a particular material or tissue from different types of radiation and its impact on body tissue. The dose rate is the amount of energy which is being delivered per unit time, typically per hour. For our purposes, though, absorbed dose rate, equivalent dose rate, and effective dose rate are the same, and essentially interchangeable, since the Geiger counter is unable to make adjustments for the type of material or the type of radiation, alpha, beta, and gamma. When Geiger counters are used to measure radiation dose rates, they are calibrated only to measure gamma rays and X-rays. It is assumed the whole body is exposed uniformly to these rays, rather than weighing the effect for a specific tissue type. Thus, the equivalent dose rate and the effective dose rate are simply the absorbed dose rate multiplied by 1, and usually displayed as microsieverts or millirems per hour by both the Geiger counter and the scintillation detector. But here's what many Geiger counter users are unaware of. Not only are Geiger counters unable to discriminate between the type of radioactivity, alpha, beta, and gamma, but unlike scintillation detectors, Geiger counters are unable to discriminate between energy levels for each radioactive event. Every particle and every ray that enters the detector window is counted as one event and assigned the same absorbed dose rate regardless of its type or energy. The Geiger counter, in other words, is designed only to measure activity, not energy. So when you measure radioactivity in microsieverts per hour with a Geiger counter, you can be almost certain that your measurement is wrong and that the Geiger counter is lying to you in spades. There is only one exception to this, which we will explain. Geiger counter tubes are calibrated to a specific energy standard, usually cesium-137. We'll use the popular LND 7313 pancake tube as an example. As the spec sheet indicates, when the tube is fully exposed to 1 milliroentgen per hour of gamma radiation from a cesium-137 source, it will indicate 55 counts per second, which is the same as 3,300 counts per minute. Thus, for cesium-137, the calibration factor is 3,300 counts per minute per milliroentgen per hour. At 2 milliroentgens per hour, the count will be doubled at 6,600 counts per minute, and so on. Less sensitive tubes will show a lower count rate per milliroentgen per hour, but typically most quality detectors will be at least 500 to 1,000 counts per minute per milliroentgen per hour. If you don't know the gamma sensitivity of your Geiger counter, simply divide the counts per minute by the number of milliroentgens per hour indicated on the screen or meter, preferably while measuring a fairly active source. Geiger counters convert these milliroentgens per hour to mrem per hour by multiplying by 1, or to microsieverts per hour by multiplying by 10. That's not an exact conversion, but it's close enough given the variables involved in measuring energy. Cesium-137, our calibration source, sheds its gamma energy at 661 keV per disintegration. Since the Geiger counter is unable to discriminate between energy levels, every detection, including alpha and beta particles, is calculated at an energy of 661 keV and converted to microsieverts per hour. The counts per second or counts per minute are simply divided by the calibration factor as explained before. Let's say you expose your LND 7313 Geiger tube to a gamma-emitting isotope with an immensely different energy level than cesium-137, or to a beta emitter with very low energy beta particles, and in each case the counter reads 6,600 counts per minute. Both of these sources will be displayed at 2 milliroentgens per hour, that is 6,600 divided by 3,300. 2 milliroentgens per hour is the same as 20 microsieverts per hour. Here's an outrageous demonstration to prove my point. Let's measure a highly active source of americium-241. The protective cover has been removed from the detector window to increase its sensitivity to alpha particles. The Geiger counter has reached over 140,000 counts per minute. How much energy is that? For this particular unit, the calibration factor is 3,545 CPM per milliroentgens per hour. 140,000 CPM divided by 3545 is between 39 and 40 milliroentgens per hour, or nearly 400 microsieverts per hour. Run for the hills. That's 9,600 microsieverts per day, which is nearly 600 times the average daily dose rate. Or, better yet, we can block all that lethal radiation with a single sheet of paper. That's because alpha particles are included in the absorbed energy calculation. The actual absorption rate of gamma energy is only about 0.14 microsieverts per hour. The Geiger counter, as you can see, is unable to distinguish between alpha and gamma when calculating the rate of absorbed energy. Over the top, yes, but Geiger counter users often employ their detectors to measure absorbed dose rate from radioactive sources like this. This vintage Fiesta-ware type plate throws off both beta and gamma radiation. According to the Geiger counter, the absorbed energy rate is about 50 microsieverts per hour, which is 70 times the average daily dose rate. But according to the scintillation detector, the rate of absorbed energy is only 0.2 microsieverts per hour, a 250-fold difference. Even if you block alpha and beta particles after setting your Geiger counter to measure the rate of absorbed energy in microsieverts, the results can still be disastrous. Your Geiger counter is calibrated to measure energy using cesium-137 as a standard. For every detection, as we said before, energy is calculated at 661 keV and converted to a dose rate in microsieverts per hour. So for much stronger gamma sources like thallium-208, which weighs in at over 2600 keV, the rate of absorbed energy per count, calculated by your Geiger counter, will be vastly underestimated. On the other hand, for weak gamma sources such as americium-241, which emits most of its energy at only 59 keV, the rate of absorbed energy per count, calculated by your Geiger counter, will be vastly overestimated. Since the absorbed dose rate is also dependent on the level of activity, that is, counts per minute, a weak but active gamma source having a high CPM is more likely to show an overinflated dose rate while a strong but relatively inactive gamma source having a low CPM is more likely to show an underinflated dose rate. Some Geiger counter manufacturers inadvertently encourage the misuse of the Geiger counter by failing to explain the limitations of the instrument. This is especially true for inexpensive units. And by promoting Geiger-based dosimeters, which supposedly measure your accumulated absorbed energy over time. But for this type of measurement, you would do far better with a scintillator, or a direct ion storage dosimeter, or a quartz fiber electrometer, or a thermoluminescent dosimeter, or a film badge. Using a Geiger tube to quantify absorbed energy can be potentially misleading. Some manufacturers also sell filters you can attach to the detector in order to increase its energy range. The filter blocks lower energy gamma rays and attenuates higher energy rays, preventing the instrument from becoming saturated as quickly. While this form of energy compensation generally affords a more accurate measurement of higher levels of radiation, it still leaves us in the dark as to where this energy falls in these expansive higher ranges. Without this knowledge, the dose rate cannot be accurately quantified. Lies! Damned lies! Is there any merit at all in using a Geiger counter to measure absorbed dose? In an emergency, and in the absence of a more suitable device, the Geiger counter and the Geiger-based dosimeter are certainly better than having nothing, as long as those energy measurements don't include alpha and beta particles. The calibration isotope for most Geiger counters, cesium-137, is positioned near the middle of a highly populated part of the energy spectrum. So given a variety of gamma sources in your environment, both weak and strong, it may provide a sort of average of absorbed energy, especially if the Geiger tube is energy compensated. But by underestimating the most energetic sources, the Geiger counter fails in alerting the user to dangerous radiation. Another scenario where dose rates, that is microsieverts per hour or millirems per hour, prove useful is in comparing readings from different Geiger counters, especially when measuring gamma radiation from the same sources. Since Geiger counters vary in sensitivity, the CPM will differ considerably from unit to unit. However, calibrating to a standard isotope, as we have discussed, adjusts for these differences in sensitivity, equalizing the baseline. Ideally then, as demonstrated in this video, all Geiger counters, with the exception of cheap, poorly made units, should show nearly the same number of microsieverts or millirems per hour when exposed to the same source, even though, as we have already shown, that reading is not likely to reflect the actual radiation dose rate. Any dose rate measurement of gamma radiation taken by any quality Geiger counter can be converted to equivalent activity, that is CPM or CPS, for your Geiger counter by multiplying the given dose rate by the calibration factor of your unit, as we showed earlier. Be sure to convert microsieverts per hour to millirems per hour before multiplying if your detector was calibrated using millirems or milliroentgens. Microsieverts and millirems, then, serve as a measure of activity, that is, counts per second or counts per minute, adjusted for the Geiger counter's particular sensitivity. This feature can be advantageous when using a variety of instruments to map gamma background radiation or even low-level radioactive fallout at different locations, similar to what was done under the U.S. Civil Defense Program in the 1950s and 60s. Using CPS or CPM alone, as this map does, skews the measurements. The level of activity may appear higher when measured with sensitive pancake tube detectors and lower when measured with smaller traditional Geiger tubes. There is no way to account for the variations shown here, but using microsieverts and millirems per hour as a proxy for activity levels these instrumental differences. So here are some do's and don'ts for using your Geiger counter. Be aware of your Geiger counter's limitations and its lying disposition. Don't use it to measure absorbed dose, or even energy exposure for that matter. Unless you are testing cesium-137, use CPM or CPS to measure activity. Leave the milliroentgens, the millirems, and the microsieverts to scintillation detectors and other energy discriminating devices. By all means do use and enjoy your Geiger counter. It's an amazing and versatile instrument. Use it to measure activity from radioactive sources. Use it to test for radiation from consumer products, building materials, antique watches, and clock dials, and antique pottery and glass. Use it to check for contamination on surfaces and in foods. Use it to detect background radiation. Use it to find radioactive rocks and minerals. Use it to discriminate between alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. Use it for conducting experiments, and use it for educational presentations. Despite the Geiger counter's limitations, I would never want to be without one.
What you got in here, fella? Ticking like a bomb.
Clicking sounds, sounds that reveal the presence of radioactive rays. The instrument, a Geiger counter, is converting radioactivity into sounds we can hear.